The thunder didn't just shake the heavens over Redemption Gulch, it shook the very foundations of Eleanor Vance's solitary life. For a year, the only visitor to her door had been the ghost of her late husband, a doctor who taught her everything about mending bodies, but nothing about mending a broken heart. Tonight, however, the storm brought a different kind of spectre. Not a memory, but a man of flesh and blood collapsing on her threshold. He was Lakota, a scout, by the look of his gear, with a cavalry bullet in his side, and the devil himself on his trail. And in that moment, with his life bleeding out onto her floorboards, Eleanor faced a choice that would either redeem her soul or see her hang from a rope. The rain fell in punishing sheets, turning the single dusty street of Redemption Gulch into a churning river of mud. From her window, Eleanor Vance watched the storm rage a mirror to the tempest that had occupied her heart since her husband Arthur had been laid to rest in the town cemetery. The small house, once filled with his quiet presence, and the scent of medicinal herbs, now felt cavernously empty. It was a well-kept tomb, a monument to a life that was no longer hers. She was tracing the rim of a cold teacup when a frantic splintering sound at her back door tore through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. It wasn't a knock, it was the sound of a body hitting wood with desperate finality. Her breath caught. No one came to the doctor's house anymore, not since the town's new physician, a gruff man named Peterson, had set up shop. Especially not at the back door, and especially not in a deluge like this. Her first instinct was fear, a cold prickle that crawled up her spine. This was a hard land, and desperate men did desperate things. She reached for the heavy iron poker by the hearth, its familiar weight a small comfort. Slowly she unlatched the door, opening it just a crack. The sight that greeted her stole the air from her lungs. A man was slumped against the frame, his face a mask of mud and pain. He was Lakota, his drenched buckskins clinging to a lean, powerful frame. Long black hair was plastered to his forehead, and his dark eyes, glazed with agony, fought to stay focused on her. But it was the dark, blossoming stain on his side that made her doctor's wife instincts override her fear. It was blood, too much of it. He tried to speak his voice, a ragged whisper lost in the gale. "Please!" Before she could respond, his strength gave out entirely. He slid down the doorframe, collapsing in a heap on her threshold, half in the storm and half in her kitchen. The rain washed over him, turning the muddy water at her stoop, a sickening shade of pink. For a paralyzing moment, Eleanor stood frozen. Helping him was suicide. The territory was on a knife's edge. General Custer's defeat was a fresh, weeping wound in the nation's psyche, and any white person caught aiding a hostile would be judged a traitor, likely by a rope thrown over the nearest sturdy branch. Sheriff Brody was a fair man, but the cavalry stationed just a day's ride away at Fort Laramie were not known for their nuance. She could slam the door, pretend she saw nothing, let the storm wash him away, like it did everything else in this unforgiving land. It would be the safe thing to do, the sensible thing. She could go back to her teacup and her ghosts, and be safe in her tomb. But then the man groaned, a low, guttural sound of pure suffering, and her husband's voice echoed in her memory, as clear as if he were standing beside her. "You don't ask who they are, Eleanor. You ask where they hurt." Arthur had lived by that code, treating prospectors ranchers, and even the occasional native who came to him in peace. It was a creed that had cost him, some said, earning him the suspicion of the more zealous townsfolk. She looked at the man bleeding on her floor. He wasn't a hostile. He was a human being in agony. In that instant, the choice was made. The woman who had been slowly dying in this house for a year decided to live even if it meant dying for real. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, Eleanor grabbed him under the arms. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and wet leather. Grunting with effort, she dragged him inside, away from the accusing eyes of the storm. The heavy oak door slammed shut, the bolt sliding home with a deafening click. The world was shut out. For now. She dragged him across the clean-scrubbed floorboards, leaving a muddy, bloody trail toward the hearth. The fire was low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She laid him gently on the bearskin rug Arthur had favored, the one place in the house that still felt warm. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy and cold. She lit another lamp, the golden light illuminating the severity of his wound. A clean hole just below his ribs on the left side. A bullet wound, for certain. It had bled profusely, but it didn't look to have hit anything vital. A grim blessing. She knew enough from Arthur to understand that internal bleeding was the real killer. "Can you understand me?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. His eyes flickered open. He nodded, a barely perceptible movement. "I am going to help you," she stated, more to convince herself than him. "You must not make a sound. Do you understand?" Again, the slight nod. His gaze was intense, wary but laced with a sliver of gratitude. Eleanor moved with an efficiency that surprised even herself. She stoked the fire, put a kettle of water on to boil, and retrieved Arthur's medical bag from the study. The familiar scent of carbolic acid and dried herbs filled her nostrils, a comforting ghost of her past life. She laid out the instruments on a clean linen cloth, probes, forceps bandages, and a bottle of whiskey. "This will hurt," she said, kneeling beside him. She held the whiskey bottle to his lips. "Drink." He took a long, shuddering pull, hissing as the liquor hit his system. She then uncorked the carbolic solution, the sharp smell filling the small room. Taking a deep breath, she took the probe in hand. The world narrowed to the small, ragged hole in the man's side, the storm outside and the storm to come. The Lakota scout had fallen at her doorstep, and she, Eleanor Vance, a grieving widow in the forgotten town of Redemption Gulch, had just declared a silent war on the United States Cavalry. The work was brutal and intimate. Eleanor, guided by 100 remembered lessons from Arthur, cleaned the wound with a focus that pushed all fear to the back of her mind. The bullet was lodged shallowly caught against a rib. Probing for it, she could feel the man's body tense, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the rug, but he made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. A low, guttural Lakota phrase escaped his lips, more prayer than curse. Finally, the forceps closed around the lead slug. With a sickening scrape against bone, she pulled it free. It was a standard army issue, a .45-70 round. Official, unforgiving. She dropped the misshapen piece of metal into a tin bowl, where it landed with a clatter that seemed to echo the gunshot itself. She worked quickly, then irrigating the wound with boiled water and carbolic, her stitches small and precise, just as Arthur had taught her. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow to stem the bleeding and comfrey to knit the flesh, bandaging it tightly with clean strips of linen. His fever was already starting to climb. She bathed his face with a cool cloth, wiping away the grime to reveal high cheekbones and a strong jaw etched with lines of hardship. He was younger than she first thought, perhaps no more than 25. His eyes followed her every move, dark pools of suspicion and pain. For 2 days he drifted in and out of consciousness. The storm passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. Eleanor moved about her house like a ghost, starting at every creak of the floorboards, every distant shout from the street. She kept the curtains drawn tight. She burned the bloody rags in the hearth, watching the evidence of her crime turn to ash. The muddy trail he'd left was scrubbed from the floor until the wood was pale, but in her mind, the stain remained. During his lucid moments, they exchanged few words. She brought him broth, which he drank gratefully. His English was careful and deliberate, learned from traders or perhaps a mission school. Why? He asked on the second evening, his voice a dry rasp. He was looking at her, his fever-bright eyes searching her face for an answer she didn't fully possess herself. Eleanor paused a spoon of broth halfway to his lips. "My husband was a healer," she said simply. "He believed a man's life was worth saving, no matter the color of his skin." "Your husband is not here." He countered, his gaze unwavering. "No." She admitted a familiar ache, tightening her chest. "He is not. But his lessons are." He seemed to consider this, then gave a small nod of acceptance. He trusted the reason, if not the woman. Later that night, as she changed his dressing, he spoke again. "Wan Bli," he said, touching his own chest. "My name is Wan Bli." "Eagle," she translated softly. She had learned a few words of the Lakota tongue from Arthur, who believed in understanding his patients. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Yes, Eagle." He looked at her expectantly. "Eleanor," she replied. "Eleanor Vance." A name. It was a fragile bridge built across a chasm of fear and mistrust. With it, he ceased to be an abstract symbol of the enemy and became Wan Bli. And she, in his eyes, was perhaps more than just a white woman, an extension of the people who had put a bullet in him. On the morning of the third day, the fragile peace was shattered. The sound was faint at first, a rhythmic pounding that grew steadily louder, vibrating through the floorboards. It was the unmistakable cadence of shod hooves, many of them. Not the clop of a single rider or a farmer's wagon, but the disciplined, thunderous beat of a cavalry column. Eleanor rushed to the front window, peering through a slit in the curtains. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A column of blue-coated soldiers was riding down the main street, their yellow guidons snapping in the breeze. They moved with a chilling purpose, their faces grim, their rifles held ready in their scabbards. At their head rode an officer, ramrod straight in his saddle, his eyes scanning the town's simple storefronts and houses with an unnerving intensity. Redemption. Gulch had seen soldiers pass through before, but this was different. They weren't passing through. They were deploying, fanning out their movements, precise and practiced. They were surrounding the town. Panic seized her. She spun around her eyes, locking with Wan Bli's. He had pushed himself up on one elbow, his face a stoic mask, but his eyes betrayed the tension coiling within him. He had heard it too. He knew what it meant. "They are here for you." She whispered the words tasting like ash. He nodded slowly, his hand instinctively going to his wounded side. "They are led by a man they call the Ghost Hunter. Captain Finch. He does not stop." The name sent a fresh wave of dread through her. Captain Alistair Finch. She'd heard whispers of him, tales told by freighters and prospectors. A man driven by a cold fury who pursued his quarry with the obsessive patience of a wolf. They said he had lost his family in a raid and now waged a personal war across the plains. She had to hide Wan Bli and hide him well. The house was small, a bedroom, this main room, a kitchen and Arthur's study. There was a small root cellar under the kitchen, accessed by a trap door hidden beneath a rug. It was damp and cramped, but it was the only chance they had. "Can you walk?" she asked, her voice urgent. He gritted his teeth and swung his legs over the side of the rug, testing his weight. A sharp hiss of pain escaped his lips, and he swayed his face pale. "I must," he said, his jaw set with determination. Leaning heavily on her, they made their way to the kitchen. Each step was an agony for him. The sound of boots and shouted orders now filled the street outside. They were close. Too close. Eleanor pulled back the worn rug, revealing the iron ring of the trap door. She heaved it open, revealing a square of blackness that smelled of damp earth and potatoes. "In here," she urged. "I'll bring you water and blankets." He lowered himself into the darkness, his movement stiff and painful. Before she could close the door, he looked up at her, his face shadowed. "They will search everywhere. He will. Let me worry about that," she said, trying to project a confidence she was far from feeling. "Eleanor," he said, his voice stopping her, "if they find me, do not let them take me alive." The request hung in the air between them, cold and heavy as a tombstone. She stared down into the darkness, into the eyes of a man asking her to be his executioner, rather than let him fall into the hands of his enemies. Before she could answer, a thunderous knock echoed from the front door, shaking the entire house. "Open up in the name of the United States Army." Her blood ran cold. The captain was at her door. She slammed the trapdoor shut, threw the rug over it, and kicked a sack of flour against the edge to obscure the lines. Taking a shaky breath, she smoothed her apron, wiped the sweat from her palms, and walked toward her reckoning. Eleanor opened the front door to a wall of blue. 2 troopers stood on her porch, their boyish faces set in stern, practiced lines. They held their Springfield carbines at a casual rest, but their eyes missed nothing. Beyond them in the muddy street sat the officer she had seen from her window. He remained mounted on a magnificent black charger that stamped impatiently, its breath misting in the cool morning air. The officer was a man carved from granite and ice. His uniform was immaculate despite the journey, his posture rigid. A neatly trimmed brown mustache did little to soften a mouth set in a permanent thin line. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, chilling blue, and they swept over her doorway and the darkness of the house behind her with a predatory assessment. This was Captain Alistair Finch. "Ma'am," he said, his voice as crisp and devoid of warmth as his eyes. He did not dismount a subtle assertion of authority. "I am Captain Finch, 7th Cavalry. We are conducting a search. With your permission, my men will need to look inside your residence." It was phrased as a request, but delivered as an order. "A search for what?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice, even her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles were white. "We are tracking a fugitive," Finch replied, his gaze unblinking. "A Lakota brave, responsible for the murder of 2 of my troopers near the Cheyenne River. He was wounded. We tracked him this far before the storm washed out the trail. We have reason to believe he sought shelter in this town." Lies. Every word felt like a lie. Wanbley had said he was a scout observing, but to argue would be to invite suspicion. "I see," Eleanor said, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "But surely, Captain, you don't think he would be here, in my home?" She infused her voice with a hint of incredulousness, the natural reaction of a respectable widow. "Ma'am, a cornered animal will crawl into any hole it can find," Finch said, a flicker of something dark in his eyes. "We will search every house, barn, and outbuilding in Redemption Gulch. It is a matter of military necessity. Now if you'll stand aside." She had no choice. To refuse would be an admission of guilt. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Of course, Captain. Please do your duty." The 2 troopers entered their boots, loud on her clean floors. They moved with a practiced, invasive efficiency. One went straight to the bedroom, the other to Arthur's study. She could hear them opening closets, tapping walls, the scrape of a crate being moved. Every sound was a hammer blow to her nerves. She remained in the doorway, forcing herself to watch Captain Finch to prevent her gaze from straying to the kitchen floor where Wanbley lay hidden. Finch, for his part, did not look away from her. It was a battle of wills conducted in silence across the space of her porch. He was studying her, cataloguing her reactions, searching for the slightest crack in her composure. She met his gaze with what she hoped was the quiet dignity of a grieving woman inconvenienced by the harsh realities of the frontier. "You are the widow Vance, are you not?" he asked suddenly, the former doctor's wife. "I am," she replied. "My condolences. A good doctor is a valuable asset in this country. A shame to lose one." His tone was flat, devoid of genuine sympathy. It was a statement of fact, not an expression of compassion. He was gathering information, piecing together the social tapestry of the town. "Thank you, Captain," she said. The trooper from the bedroom emerged. "Nothing in there, sir. Just clothes and linens." The second trooper came out of the study. "Clear, sir. Books, medical supplies, smells of chemicals." Eleanor's breath hitched. Chemicals. The carbolic acid she'd used to clean Wanbley's wound. She prayed the scent wasn't strong enough to be suspicious in a doctor's former home. Finch's gaze sharpened a slight, almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes. He seemed to sniff the air. "Chemicals, you say, Private Miller?" "Yes, sir, like a hospital," the private confirmed. Finch continued to stare at Eleanor. The silence stretched thin and taut. He was weighing the information. She could feel the pressure of his scrutiny, a physical force pushing against her. She forced herself to remain still, to not fidget or look away. "Very well," Finch said at last, breaking the tension. "Check the kitchen and then be on your way." The troopers moved towards the kitchen. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She had to do something, create a diversion, however small. "Captain," she said, her voice clear and strong, "while my home is of course at your disposal, I must ask you to instruct your men to be careful. That is my late husband's legacy. His instruments, his books. They are all I have left of him." She allowed a slight tremor to enter her voice, a touch of a widow's grief. It wasn't entirely an act. Finch's gaze flickered from her face to the study, then back. "My men are professionals, Mrs. Vance, not vandals." The troopers entered the kitchen. She could hear them opening the pantry, their footsteps echoing on the floorboards directly above the cellar. She held her breath, listening for any sound from below, a cough, a groan, anything. There was only silence. She prayed Wanbley had understood the danger that he was remaining perfectly still. "Cellar's under here, sir," Private Miller called out. Eleanor's stomach plummeted. "Looks like a heavy one. Rug and a flour sack over it." This was it. It was over. Finch's cold blue eyes locked onto hers again. He was watching for her reaction. She forced her expression to remain neutral, a mask of weary patience. "It's a root cellar," she screamed in her mind. "Every house has one." He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent interrogation. The fate of 2 lives hung in that heavy pause. Then, to her utter astonishment, he gave a slight shake of his head. "Leave it," Finch commanded. "We don't have time to empty every root cellar in this town. The man we're looking for is wounded, but not so badly he could pull up a trap door and haul a rug over it by himself. He's hiding in a barn or a hayloft. Easy access. Let's move." The troopers reappeared, their expressions unquestioning. "Yes, sir." They filed out of the house, their presence receding like a foul tide. Finch was the last to leave. He paused on her porch, turning back to face her. "My apologies for the intrusion. Mrs. Vance." He said the words a hollow formality. "Lock your door. There is a killer in this town." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more of a threat than a courtesy, then turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, his voice already barking orders to his men as they moved to the next house down the street. Eleanor sagged against the doorframe, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. She slammed the door shut and leaned against it, her forehead pressed to the cool wood, gasping for air. They were safe for now, but Finch's shadow still lingered. He had called his search off not out of conviction, but out of logic. And if his logic failed, he would be back. The iron noose around Redemption Gulch had been drawn tight, and she and the man in her cellar were caught squarely within it. The occupation of Redemption Gulch settled in like a suffocating fever. Captain Finch's blue-coated soldiers were everywhere, a constant menacing presence. They established a command post in the abandoned blacksmith shop, their horses tied to every available rail. A curfew was imposed. No one was to be on the streets after sundown. Travel in or out of the town was forbidden without a pass signed by Finch himself. The daily rhythms of life ground to a halt, replaced by an atmosphere of collective suspicion. Finch was methodical. His men, led by a humorless sergeant named Cutler, conducted their search with relentless precision. They swept through the stables, the general store, the saloon, and the church. They upended haylofts, emptied storage sheds, and peered into every dark corner. The townsfolk endured the invasion with a mixture of resentment and fear. They were good God-fearing people, but Finch's cold glare made them all feel like conspirators. For Eleanor, every day was a trial of nerves. She maintained her routine with rigid control, forcing herself to walk to Croft's general store for supplies, to nod politely at neighbors who now looked at her with a new questioning curiosity. She was the reclusive widow, the one who kept to herself. Such isolation, once a comfort, was now a liability. It made her different, and in a town under siege, different was dangerous. Silas Croft, the proprietor of the store, was a weasel of a man with eyes that were always calculating. "Terrible business, Mrs. Vance," he said, leaning over the counter as he weighed out a bag of beans. His voice was a low, conspiratorial whisper. "The captain seems convinced this savage is right here among us. Makes you wonder who you can really trust, doesn't it?" His eyes bored into her, and Eleanor felt a chill. Croft was a gossip, a man who traded in whispers. She knew he was probing not just her, but everyone. He was the kind of man who would sell his own mother for a commendation from the army. "I'm sure Captain Finch knows his business, Mr. Croft," she replied coolly, handing him the coins. "I just pray this is over soon." She left the store feeling as though she'd just escaped a trap. The whispers were starting. She could feel them at her back as she walked down the street, the veiled glances from behind curtained windows. Her nights were spent in the dim lamplit quiet of her kitchen, tending to Wanbley. She would wait until the town was shrouded in the deepest darkness, until the patrols had passed her street before lifting the trapdoor. She would bring him food, fresh water, and clean bandages. He was healing his strong constitution, fighting off the infection. The fever had broken, and the color was returning to his face. In the confines of the small cellar, an unlikely bond was forged. He spoke of his life not as a warrior, but as a man. He described the rolling plains of his homeland, the wisdom of his elders, the way the stars looked, in a sky untouched by the smoke of settlements. He told her his purpose in being so close to the cavalry column. He wasn't raiding. He was a Wawayaka, one who watches and reports. His people were starving, confined to the reservation, and he was tracking the movements of the soldiers and the buffalo herds they so often slaughtered for sport, seeking a safe passage for a small hunting party. He had been spotted by a patrol, and the chase had begun. They shot without a word. He said, his voice low and bitter in the darkness. "Saw my skin, and that was reason enough." In turn, Eleanor found herself speaking of Arthur. She told Wanbley of his kindness, his unwavering belief in the sanctity of life, his frustration with the senseless violence that plagued the territory. Talking about him to this stranger in her cellar felt more natural than speaking to anyone in the town above. Wanbley listened without judgment, his silence a comforting presence. He understood loss. He understood living in a world that no longer felt like home. The danger above them was ever present. One evening, as she was applying a fresh poultice to his wound, the sound of heavy boots on her porch sent a jolt of terror through them both. She quickly doused the lamp, plunging the kitchen into darkness, her hand over Wanbley's arm in a silent command to be still. "Mrs. Vance," a voice called out. It was Sheriff Brodie. Her mind raced. Was this a friendly visit, or was he here on Finch's orders? She couldn't risk him coming inside. She crept to the front of the house and opened the door a mere crack. Sheriff Brodie stood on her porch, his face looking worn and older than his 40 years. His badge seemed to weigh heavily on his chest. "Sheriff," she said, her voice tight. "It's past curfew." "I know, Eleanor. I know." He sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Finch has me running ragged. I wanted to check on you. Things are tense. People are talking." "Talking about what?" she asked, though she already knew. "Just talk," he said evasively. "You keep to yourself. After Arthur's passing, folks notice things. Silas Croft mentioned you bought extra bandages yesterday, and carbolic acid." Eleanor's heart hammered. "I am a doctor's widow sheriff. I always keep medical supplies on hand. You of all people should know that." "I do," Brodie said quickly, holding up his hands. "And I told Croft to mind his own damn business. But you need to be careful. Finch is like a bloodhound. He smells desperation. He's starting to think this Indian isn't just hiding, but that he's being helped." The warning was clear. Brodie was on her side for now, but he was also a man of the law, caught in an impossible position. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I am fine. Just weary of all this. I want my town back." "We all do," he said, tipping his hat. "Lock your door, Eleanor." She watched him walk away, his shoulders slumped. The visit had not been a comfort. It was a confirmation of her worst fears. The noose was tightening, not just around Wanbley, but around her as well. The town's whispers were growing louder, and soon Captain Finch would hear them. She returned to the kitchen, her face grim. Time was running out. Every shadow seemed to hold a blue-coated soldier, and every friendly face in town now held a glimmer of suspicion. The summons came 2 days later. It wasn't a soldier with a rifle, but Captain Finch himself, knocking politely at her front door in the full light of day. His presence was a stark violation of her quiet sanctuary. He was alone, which was somehow more menacing than if he'd brought a squad. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Forgive the intrusion. I was hoping I might have a moment of your time. This will be far more pleasant than a formal interrogation at my command post." It was an invitation wrapped around a threat. Refusal was not an option. "Of course, Captain," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Please." He entered her home, his polished boots silent on the floorboards. He removed his hat, holding it in his gloved hands. He wasn't here to search. He was here to dissect her piece by piece. He let his eyes roam the room, taking in the neat bookshelves, the framed photograph of Arthur on the mantel, the quiet, orderly space. "Please have a seat," she offered, gesturing to the armchair opposite the hearth. "Thank you," he said, seating himself with a formal stiffness. He did not relax. His posture remained ramrod straight. "I confess, Mrs. Vance, I find myself in a difficult position. My search has yielded nothing. It is a statistical improbability that a wounded man could vanish so completely in a town this small, which leads me to a single troubling conclusion. He has help. He paused, his pale eyes pinning her in place. The question is, who would help a man who represents the very savagery that threatens to swallow us all? Eleanor sat opposite him, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Inside her heart was a frantic drum. I cannot imagine, Captain. The people of this town are good, law-abiding citizens. Are they? Finch countered a faint, mirthless smile touching his lips. Or are they simply afraid? Perhaps someone's fear of the man is outweighed by their mistrust of the uniform I wear. Or perhaps it is something else. A misplaced sense of pity, perhaps. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential, almost sympathetic tone. Let me tell you a story, Mrs. Vance. 8 years ago, I was stationed at Fort Phil Kearny. I had a wife, a woman not unlike yourself, full of grace and a belief in the fundamental goodness of people. Her name was Clara. We had a son, William. He was 5 years old. Eleanor felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She knew this tactic. He was trying to build a bridge to find common ground. We were living in a small, homesteaded cabin a few miles from the fort. He continued, his eyes distant, focused on a memory that was clearly as sharp as broken glass. I was away on a week-long patrol. When I returned, the cabin was a smoking ruin, the work of a Cheyenne raiding party. They had been brutal. My boy, William, He stopped, his jaw clenching so hard, a muscle jumped. And my Clara, they took her. We found her body 2 days later. What they did to her. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his composure returning like an iron mask. He looked directly at Eleanor, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. That is the enemy I hunt, Mrs. Vance. Not a man, but a plague. A mindless, remorseless violence that preys on the innocent. The man you may think is just a poor, wounded soul is a part of that. He shares their blood, their spirit. He would see you and everyone in this town suffer the same fate as my family, without a moment's hesitation. Do you understand me? The story was horrific, designed to strip away any sympathy she might have and replace it with visceral fear. And it almost worked. She could picture the horror, the grief of the man sitting before her. But then she pictured Wanbley, the quiet dignity in his eyes, the way he spoke of his people and his land. The two images clashed, refusing to reconcile. That is a terrible story, Captain. She said, her voice quiet but firm. And I am truly sorry for your loss. No one should endure such a thing. She met his gaze. But to paint all people with the same brush of hate, is that not a savagery of its own? Finch's eyes narrowed. Her response was not the one he had expected. It is not hate, madam. It is knowledge. It is a truth written in the blood of my wife and child, a truth I will honor until the day I die. He stood abruptly, his visit concluded. He had laid his cards on the table. He believed she was the one. He had given her his reason, his justification, and now a final unspoken warning. I will find him, Mrs. Vance, he said from the doorway, and I will deal with anyone who stands in my way. Think on what I have told you. Think about what that animal is truly capable of. He left, and the house felt colder, more violated than when his men had searched it. The air was thick with the poison of his grief. That night, when she descended into the cellar, she was quiet and withdrawn. Wanbley sensed the change immediately. The ghost hunter, he stated. It wasn't a question. He spoke with you. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. She busied herself with his bandage, her movements jerky. Finally, Wanbley reached out and gently took her wrist, forcing her to stop. His touch was warm and firm. "What did he tell you?" he asked. Hesitantly, she recounted Finch's story, the smoking cabin, the murdered child, the tortured wife. As she spoke, she watched Wanbley's face. His expression was grim, but there was no shock, no denial. There was something else, a flicker of recognition. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the small earthen space. "The smoking cabin on Powder Creek," Wanbley said softly, his voice thick with a different kind of pain. "8 winters ago." Eleanor stared at him, her blood running cold. "You know of it." "My people speak of it," he said, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow. "It is a story of great shame to us. Not because we did it, but because we were blamed." He looked up at her, and the truth in his eyes was as clear and devastating as a lightning strike. The raid was not done by the Cheyenne. It was a group of white men, whiskey traders. The husband, the soldier he had run them off his land. They came back for revenge when he was gone. They dressed as Cheyenne to hide their crime and to bring the soldier's wrath down upon the tribes. My uncle was part of a hunting party that found the cabin after. He saw the tracks of their shod horses. He saw the empty whiskey bottles they left behind. He tried to tell the fort commander, but they called him a liar and drove him away. The revelation struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. Finch's entire crusade, his cold, righteous fury, was built on a lie. A monstrous, tragic lie. He wasn't hunting the men who had destroyed his life. He was hunting their victims, channeling his pain into a blind, all-consuming hatred for an entire people. "He doesn't know," Eleanor whispered, the horror of it dawning on her. "He does not want to know," Wanbley corrected gently. "His truth is easier. It gives his pain a face." Eleanor looked at the man before her, the man Finch had painted as a monster. She saw not savagery, but a profound sadness for a world so steeped in misunderstanding and violence. And she knew then, with absolute certainty, that she could not let Finch have him. It was no longer just about saving one man's life. It was about standing against a darkness that threatened to consume them all. Her fear was gone, burned away by a cold, resolute anger. She would not just hide Wanbley. She would get him out. The realization that Finch was driven by a phantom settled in Eleanor's soul like a shard of ice. Her fear had been replaced by a dangerous clarity. She was no longer just a protector. She was an agent of a truth that had to survive. Redemption. Gulch could not be Wanbley's tomb, and Finch's blind vengeance could not be its final word. An escape plan, once a desperate fantasy, now became a logistical puzzle she had to solve. The town was an island. Finch's patrols circled it day and night. The main road was blockaded, but Eleanor's mind, sharpened by a year of solitary observation, began to work the angles. She knew the town's hidden rhythms. She knew the patrol schedules, the brief window at the changing of the guard just before dawn. And she knew the land beyond the town, limits the gullies and washes where she and Arthur used to walk. Her plan began to form, built on desperation and an intimate knowledge of her surroundings. To the east of town, past the cemetery, the land dropped into a series of dry creek beds and ravines, thick with cottonwood and scrub brush. It was difficult terrain, impassable for a cavalry column, moving at speed, but perfect for a single man on foot to disappear into. The challenge was getting there. She needed a diversion, something big enough to draw the attention of every soldier in town, to pull the patrols from their posts and focus Finch's obsessive gaze in the opposite direction. The answer lay in the west, at the old abandoned assay office. It was a tinderbox of dry wood and old papers situated precariously close to the livery stable, where the cavalry kept most of their horses. A fire there would be a catastrophe, a 5-alarm crisis that would demand every available hand. The risk was immense. Arson was a hanging offense. If caught, she would be damned not only by the army, but by the very town she was trying to navigate. But the alternative waiting for Finch to inevitably tear her house apart was no alternative at all. For the next 2 days, she made her preparations in secret. She explained the plan to Wanbley in hushed tones in the cellar. His wound was healing well. He was weak, but mobile. He listened intently, his expression a mixture of awe at her audacity and grim understanding of the stakes. "The fire is a great risk," he said, his gaze serious. "For you." "The greater risk is doing nothing," she countered. "You need to be ready. When you hear the church bell ringing, that's the fire alarm. Count to 100, slowly. Then come out. Head east directly for the largest oak tree on the cemetery hill. Keep it on your left shoulder. Follow the line of the ridge down into the coulee. From there, the spirits must guide you." "And you?" he asked. "I will be setting the fire," she said simply, as if discussing the weather. On the third night, a moonless, overcast sky provided the perfect cloak of darkness. The air was heavy and still. Eleanor, dressed in a dark skirt and blouse, her face pale but resolute in the lamplight. She decanted a small amount of kerosene from her lamp into a sealed flask. Her hands did not tremble. She was a different woman from the one who had opened her door to the storm a week ago. She went to the cellar one last time. "Be safe, Wanbley," she whispered into the darkness. "You walk in courage, Eleanor Vance." He replied, his voice filled with a respect that fortified her more than any weapon could. She slipped out her back door and moved through the shadows of the town. The streets were deserted, the curfew absolute. A lone trooper stood guard outside the saloon, his silhouette stark against the light spilling from the window. She flattened herself in an alleyway, her heart pounding, until he passed on his slow, predictable route. The assay office loomed before her, a skeletal wreck of a building. Its windows were boarded up, its door hanging from a single hinge. The livery stable next to it was dark and silent, the horses shifting and snorting softly within. The air smelled of hay and manure. This was the point of no return. She uncorked the flask, splashing the kerosene on the dry, warped floorboards just inside the doorway. She laid a trail of it to a pile of old newspapers and claim receipts in the corner. Then she pulled a match from her pocket. The rasp of the phosphorus striking the rough wood of the wall sounded like a cannon shot in the silence. The flame flared to life, a tiny, defiant star in the oppressive dark. She hesitated for only a second, the image of the whole town burning, flashing through her mind. But then she thought of Finch's cold eyes, of Wanbley's quiet dignity. She tossed the match onto the kerosene-soaked papers. The fire caught with a hungry whoosh. Flames erupted, licking up the dry walls with terrifying speed. She didn't wait to watch. She turned and fled, melting back into the shadows, her path taking her not home, but in a wide circle toward the center of town. She needed to be seen to be just another panicked citizen. It took less than a minute, a flicker of orange light in a window, then another. A shout from the saloon guard. "Fire, fire at the assay office." Then the frantic, clanging toll of the church bell began shattering the night. It was the signal. The town exploded into chaos. Doors flew open. Men half-dressed ran into the street, shouting. The scene was exactly as she had pictured it. Blue-coated soldiers poured from the blacksmith shop, their officers barking orders. Their immediate concern was the livery, the horses. Captain Finch appeared, his face a mask of fury in the firelight. "Sergeant, get a bucket brigade. Save the stables, I want a perimeter. No one leaves this town." Amid the pandemonium, Eleanor saw her chance. She joined a group of women rushing toward the fire, feigning panic, adding her voice to the cacophony. From the corner of her eye, she looked east toward the cemetery hill. There was nothing but darkness, no movement. She prayed Wanbley had made it out, that he was already swallowed by the night. Sheriff Brodie was there, trying to organize the civilians, his face smudged with soot. He saw Eleanor in the crowd. "Eleanor, get back, it's not safe." His eyes held a question. He had to suspect. The timing, the location, it was too perfect to be an accident. But he said nothing more, his face an unreadable mask as he turned back to fight the flames. Eleanor allowed herself to be herded back with the other women, her face a perfect portrait of fear and concern. She watched the fire rage, a brilliant, terrible beacon. It was her sin, her sacrifice, and her hope all burning together against the black prairie sky. She had thrown the dice. Now all she could do was wait for dawn and pray that Wanbley the eagle had found his wings. The fire at the assay office was a hungry beast, but by the time the first grey fingers of dawn stretched across the sky, it was a smouldering, blackened skeleton. The chaos of the night subsided, replaced by an exhausted, smoky silence. Captain Finch stalked through the weary crowd, his face a mask of cold fury. The fire had been a diversion. He had been played. His gaze swept over the soot-stained faces and landed on Eleanor. She stood with a quiet stillness that set her apart from the others, a calm island in a sea of fatigue. He walked directly to her. "Mrs. Vance?" He said, his voice dangerously low. "A most eventful night." "Indeed, Captain," she replied, her own voice steady. "We are all fortunate the livery was spared." "Fortunate," Finch repeated the word, a poison on his tongue. He gestured to Sergeant Cutler. "Conduct a roll call. Every man, woman, and child. Now." When Sheriff Brodie protested, Finch cut him off. "The fire, Sheriff, was a diversion. Our fugitive is gone, and I believe his accomplice is standing right here." He pointed a gloved finger at Eleanor. A collective gasp went through the crowd. "You have no proof, Captain," Eleanor said, her chin held high. "Only suspicion born of your own failure." Finch's face tightened. "I have all the—" He was cut off by the thunder of hooves. Private Miller galloped into town, his face pale with shock. "Captain," he shouted, reining his horse to a skidding halt. "We found tracks leading east into the coulee. But, sir, we found Corporal Evans. He's dead." A cold silence fell. "An arrow," Miller stammered. "Clean through the throat." The news was a spark in a powder keg. For Finch, it was the final, damning piece of evidence. "He went east," he snarled. He spun to his men, his voice a low growl of command. "Mount up, every man. We ride immediately. I want him found. I want him dead." But as the soldiers scrambled, Sheriff Brodie stepped directly in front of Finch, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Several of the town's men moved to stand with him, their faces grim. "No," Brodie said, his voice calm but unyielding. "You're done here, Finch. This is my town. You will not turn this street into your personal hunting ground." "Get out of my way, Sheriff," Finch threatened, "or I'll have you arrested for obstructing military justice." "You'll have to go through all of us," said a burly rancher beside Brodie. It was Eleanor, however, who broke the standoff. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on Finch, her voice clear and strong. "He didn't kill your family, Captain." Finch stared at her as if she'd gone mad. "What did you say? Your wife and son?" Eleanor continued her voice, resonating with a truth she knew to be absolute. "It wasn't the Cheyenne. It was whiskey traders, white men. They disguised themselves to turn the army against the tribes. The man you are hunting knows this. His people saw the shod horse prints and the whiskey bottles left behind. They tried to tell the commander at the fort, but no one would listen. The words struck Finch harder than any bullet. He recoiled, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. "Lies," he whispered, but the word had no conviction. It was a desperate plea against a truth that echoed in the dark corners of his memory, doubts he had buried under a mountain of rage for 8 long years. "Ask yourself, Captain." Eleanor pressed her voice, softening with a sliver of pity. "Ask yourself why your hatred has never brought you peace. It is because you have been aiming it at the wrong ghosts." Finch stood frozen, his entire world collapsing. The righteous cause that had defined him was nothing but a hollow lie. He looked at his soldiers waiting for a command he could no longer give. He looked at the defiant townsfolk. Finally, he looked at Eleanor, her face a mirror of his own tragic failure. Without another word, Captain Alastair Finch turned. He walked to his horse, mounted it with the stiff movements of an old man, and rode away not east in pursuit, but west back toward the fort, a solitary figure swallowed by the vast, indifferent prairie. In the stunned silence, Eleanor looked toward the eastern hills. Wanbley was gone, a ghost on the wind. She had faced down the cavalry, defied the whispers, and gambled everything on an act of human decency. She was no longer just the doctor's widow, a ghost in a lonely house. She was Eleanor Vance of Redemption Gulch, and she had found her own resurrection in the heart of the fire. If this story of courage in the face of prejudice moved you, if the tale of Eleanor Vance and her impossible choice in a town called Redemption reminds you that the greatest battles are often fought in the quiet corners of the human heart, then please help us keep these stories alive. The Old West was more than just cowboys and outlaws. It was a land of complex moral choices, of forgotten heroes, and of truths buried by time. By liking this video, sharing it with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and subscribing to our channel, you ensure that more of these forgotten histories are brought into the light. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the dusty, dramatic, and deeply human heart of the American West. Thank you for listening, and may you always have the courage to answer the knock at your door.